Christmas miracle, dog saves life. The shocking twist will bring you to tears. Sophia's foot slipped on the icy bank of the creek, sending a shock of fear through her. The ice cracked under her weight, and before she could even scream, the freezing water swallowed her whole. The current was swift, pulling her down deeper. Her limbs went numb. She fought, kicking desperately, but the cold was too much. Panic surged in her chest, but the world around her felt distant, blurry. Max, the family dog, barked frantically from the edge of the creek. His fur was matted with snow as he paced back and forth, his eyes locked on Sophia. She gasped for air, but the water seemed to pull her down further, a suffocating force. "Sophia?" Her father, Marcos, called from a distance, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring creek. Max darted forward, his instincts kicking in. He leaped into the water with a ferocity Sophia had never seen in him before. Despite the icy waters, Max swam with purpose, pushing through the current as his paws cut through the water, reaching for Sophia. She could barely keep her eyes open, her body too numb to move, but she felt the pressure of something pulling her. Max's jaws closed around the fabric of her coat, and with a surge of strength, he yanked her upward, dragging her to the shallows. Marcos reached them in a panic, his hands shaking as he pulled Sophia from the water, cradling her against his chest. "Sophia. Sophia, stay with me." His voice cracked. He was already shivering, but his focus was on his daughter. Max collapsed on the bank beside them, panting heavily, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. "Max?" Sophia's voice was weak, but she managed to lift her head just enough to look at the dog. Max's chest heaved, his eyes barely open, his fur drenched and heavy. "Max," Marcos repeated, his voice low with concern. He checked the dog's breathing, trying to assess the damage. Max's heart raced, but the dog's body temperature was dangerously low. The chances of him surviving this were slim. With Sophia wrapped in a blanket, Marcos scrambled to his feet, picking Max up as best he could. "We're getting you help, buddy. Just hold on." As they made their way back to the house, Sophia's thoughts were foggy, the shock of the near drowning still gripping her. Her father was murmuring reassurances, but they didn't feel real. The only thing that mattered right now was Max. He had saved her, again. He had always been there, ever since her mother's death the previous year, always a comforting presence at her side. But now it seemed like it was Max who needed saving. When they finally reached the house, Marcos rushed to the phone, dialing the local vet's emergency number. The tension was thick. Every second counted. Sophia sat beside Max, brushing her fingers through his wet fur, whispering to him, hoping somehow he could hear her. "Please, Max. You have to be okay." Her words felt like a prayer, though she had never been religious. It didn't matter. All she wanted was for him to be okay. The vet arrived within minutes, her face grave as she assessed Max. "He's hypothermic," she said after a quick check. "We'll do what we can, but he's in critical condition." Sophia's heart dropped. She couldn't think of a Christmas without Max. The thought felt impossible. Marcos looked over at his daughter, his own face tight with worry. He squeezed her shoulder, but he couldn't mask his fear. Max had always been a fighter, but this was different. The water had been too cold, the strain too much. "Can you save him?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vet didn't answer right away. She just nodded, her expression serious, and went to work, placing Max on the heating pad and administering fluids. But nothing could quiet the worry gnawing at Sophia's heart. As the vet worked, Sophia glanced at the small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, its lights twinkling softly. It didn't feel like Christmas anymore. It felt like everything was falling apart. Max had saved her life tonight. The least she could do was make sure he had a chance to survive this. Sophia wiped away a tear that had escaped and turned her focus back to the dog who had never failed her. "You had to make it. You just had to." Sophia sat next to Max, her eyes fixed on his still form. The warmth of the heating pad didn't seem to be doing enough. His chest rose and fell slowly, and his breathing was shallow, ragged. She kept her hand pressed to his side, willing him to fight, to keep going. Her father was pacing across the room, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to the vet for the second time in an hour. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of the heater humming in the background. "I don't know if he's going to make it," Marcos said quietly, his words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. He had a look of resignation on his face, as though he already knew the answer. Sophia's throat tightened. "Don't say that," she whispered. "He's going to make it?" Marcos sat down beside her, rubbing his face in exhaustion. "I don't know, Sophia. He's been through a lot." Max whimpered softly, his head shifting slightly as though he was trying to wake up. Sophia's heart leapt in her chest. "Max," she gasped, leaning forward. "Max, are you okay?" The dog's eyes fluttered open, his gaze blurry, but his tail gave a weak wag, just enough to show he was still there. Sophia felt a small flicker of hope ignite in her chest. "He's still with us," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Marcos reached out, placing his hand gently on Sophia's shoulder. "He's strong," he said quietly, his voice softening. "He's a fighter just like you?" Sophia nodded, but the unease in her heart remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that Max had been pushed to his limits. The dog had saved her life, had put himself in danger to keep her safe. But what if that had been too much? What if she couldn't save him in return? "Dad," Sophia began, her voice small, Can I go outside for a minute?" Marcos hesitated but then nodded. "Okay, but don't stay out too long. It's cold?" Sophia bundled up quickly, wrapping a scarf around her neck before stepping outside into the quiet night. The snow had stopped falling, but the ground was still covered with a thick layer of frost. She walked across the yard, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Everything felt distant. The lights from the house flickered in the distance, but the air was so still it was as if the world had stopped moving altogether. Sophia paused by the old swing set her mother had put up for her when she was younger. She sat down on one of the swings, letting her legs dangle, and stared at the small Christmas tree in their front yard, its lights twinkling faintly in the night. The beauty of it only reminded her how much she missed her mother. "Mom," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "I need you." It felt silly to talk to her mother, but Sophia didn't know who else to turn to. The emptiness in her chest had only grown since that horrible day a year ago. The grief hadn't lessened despite the passing of time. And now, with Max fighting for his life, it felt as though the weight of the world was too much for her to bear alone. As she sat there, silent and still, a sudden thought crossed her mind, something her mother had told her when she was younger. "Christmas is about miracles, Sophia," her mother had said. "Not just the ones you see but the ones you feel. The love we have for each other, the hope we carry in our hearts. Those are the real miracles." Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her mother's words had always brought her comfort, even in the darkest moments. But this time they felt more like a plea. She wasn't sure if she believed in miracles anymore. But she had to. For Max. For herself. For her dad. With a sudden burst of determination, Sophia stood up, brushing the snow from her coat. She turned toward the house, her footsteps quickening as she made her way back inside. The warmth hit her the moment she entered, but it didn't bring the same comfort it usually did. Not without Max there, his presence filling the space like it always had. Marcos was still sitting next to the dog, his head buried in his hands. Sophia walked over and knelt beside Max, taking a deep breath as she reached for his paw. "You've got to fight, Max. Please," she whispered. "You can't leave me. Not now." Max's eyes opened again, slowly, and he looked up at her. His gaze was weak but full of something she couldn't quite name. A silent understanding, maybe. A promise. The sound of the front door opening interrupted the moment, and the vet walked in. "I have good news," she said, a faint smile on her lips. "He's showing some improvement. His temperature is rising and his vitals are stabilizing. It's still touch and go, but he's got a chance." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She turned to Max, her eyes shining. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "I knew you would be." Max gave a small, tentative wag of his tail. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Sophia the hope she needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe in the miracle her mother had spoken of. Not the kind that appeared out of nowhere, but the one that came from the love and strength they had for each other. Maybe Christmas wasn't so hopeless after all. Christmas morning came with a sense of stillness. The house was quiet, the usual hum of holiday cheer replaced by an air of tension. Sophia was sitting beside Max, her fingers gently running through his fur. He had made it through the night, but he was still weak, his body sluggish and trembling. Every so often she would catch him watching her with those familiar loyal eyes, and in those moments she felt the weight of the love that had always connected them. It was a love that had been tested, and now, it seemed, it was time to repay him for all the times he had stood by her side. Marcos was in the kitchen, attempting to prepare a light breakfast, but it was clear he was distracted. His movements were slower than usual, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the last few days had worn him down to his core. He had hardly slept, constantly checking on Max and Sophia, making sure they were both okay. But as much as he tried to keep a brave face, it was evident that his hope was hanging by a thread. Sophia hadn't said much this morning. She had gone through the motions of getting dressed and coming downstairs, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She kept looking at Max, watching for any sign of improvement. The vet had said there was a chance, but Sophia wasn't sure if that was enough. Max was more than a pet to her. He was her protector, her confidant, the one thing that had kept her grounded after her mother's death. If she lost him too, she didn't know how she would manage to keep going. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his fur. "Please, Max," she whispered, almost afraid to speak the words aloud. "Please, you can't leave me. You promised, remember? You promised you'd never leave me." Max's tail gave a faint, weak wag in response, as though trying to reassure her that he wasn't going anywhere. But Sophia could tell that he was still struggling. His body was cold to the touch, his energy drained. She felt a deep knot of fear tighten in her chest. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. Not now. Marcos came over, kneeling down beside them. He looked at Sophia and smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion he felt. "How's he doing?" he asked quietly, his voice hoarse. Sophia sighed, running her hand gently along Max's side. "He's still not himself," she said softly. "But he's hanging in there." Marcos nodded. "That's all we can ask for right now." A quiet silence stretched between them. Neither of them knew what to say next. Both were waiting for a miracle that they weren't sure was coming. Sophia wished she could make things better, could somehow force Max to heal. But it wasn't in her power. All she had was her love for him and the hope that he would somehow pull through. As they sat there, the weight of the moment settling in, the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence. Marcos stood up, brushing off his pants. "I'll get it," he said. Sophia didn't look up as he walked away. Her gaze was fixed on Max, her heart aching with every breath he took. It wasn't fair. He had given everything for her, and now it seemed like he was the one who needed saving. A few moments later, Marcos returned, his footsteps quick as he entered the living room. "Sophia," he said, his voice filled with something that made her look up. "You need to see this." Sophia stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. What was it? What could possibly be so urgent at this moment? She walked over to the door, still holding her breath, and froze as she saw what awaited her outside. It was a small, neatly wrapped gift box sitting right on the front porch. There was no card, no indication of who it was from. Just a gift placed carefully in the snow. Sophia's heart raced. She had no idea who could have left it there. Her first instinct was to reach for it, but she hesitated, unsure if this was just another one of those coincidences that had come to haunt her. Was it a sign? Or was it just a random occurrence? "Go ahead, sweetheart," Marcos said softly, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. "It's okay." Sophia bent down, picking up the small box. It was surprisingly light and the paper was soft to the touch. She turned it over in her hands, trying to figure out who might have left it for her. But there was nothing, just the simple gift and her growing curiosity. She returned inside and set the box down on the table. It felt strange, holding something so ordinary in the middle of everything else that felt so wrong. She carefully peeled away the wrapping paper, revealing a small wooden ornament in the shape of a heart. It was simple but beautiful. In the center of the heart, there was a tiny inscription, "Love never leaves." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She ran her fingers over the delicate carving, the words etched into the wood. "Love never leaves." It felt like a message from her mother, or perhaps from the universe itself. Sophia wasn't sure, but it struck her deeply, resonating in a way that was almost impossible to explain. She held the ornament close to her chest, closing her eyes as the weight of the words sunk in. For a brief moment, she let herself believe in the impossible, that love could conquer all, that it could even transcend death itself. It was then that Max, still lying on the floor, let out a weak but unmistakable growl. His eyes flickered open again and his tail gave another small wag. Sophia looked at him, her heart swelling. Max was still here. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. She turned to her father, her eyes shining. "Dad, I think he's going to be okay." Marcos looked at her, his own expression softening as he saw the hope in her eyes. "I think you might be right." The day dragged on in a haze of uncertainty. Despite the small improvement in Max's condition, the fear still lingered in the air, thick and unyielding. The clock on the wall ticked away, each minute passing like an hour, but neither Sophia nor her father could find comfort in the passage of time. Max had managed to drink a little water earlier, and his breathing had steadied, but his eyes still looked distant, as if he were fighting something deeper than just the cold. Sophia sat on the floor beside him, her back against the couch, her fingers gently tracing the lines of the small wooden ornament she'd found on the porch. Love never leaves. She had never believed in signs or miracles, But the words on that ornament were like a lifeline. A reminder that perhaps, no matter how dark things seemed, there was still something to hold on to. Marcos had gone to the store for a while, leaving Sophia alone with Max. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Sophia wasn't sure what that something was, but she knew one thing: she couldn't lose Max. She had learned that lesson the hard way last year, when her mother had passed away suddenly, leaving a void that nothing seemed capable of filling. Her mother had been the anchor that held the family together, and without her, Sophia had often felt lost, adrift in a sea of grief. But Max had been the one thing that never wavered. He had always been there, tail wagging, eyes full of unconditional love. He had stood by her through every tear, every dark night, every moment of fear and doubt. He had given her hope when it seemed like there was none. Now it was her turn to give that hope back. Max stirred slightly, his head lifting just a little. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer to him, her hand resting gently on his side. "Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Come on, buddy. You can do this. I need you." His eyes met hers, though they were still glassy and unfocused. There was a fleeting moment of recognition, and for that moment, Sophia felt as if she had connected with him on a level deeper than words could express. But then Max's body trembled and he let out a low, mournful whimper, his eyes closing again. Sophia's heart shattered. She couldn't stand to see him like this. But she knew that there was nothing more she could do except stay by his side and wait. The vet had said it would take time for his body to warm up, for the effects of the hypothermia to pass. She didn't know how long that would take or if Max would pull through, but the thought of losing him, of being left alone, was unbearable. Her mother's words echoed in her mind again. Love never leaves. Sophia closed her eyes, pressing the ornament to her chest, holding it tightly as though the simple object could somehow transfer all her love, all her hope into Max. She felt a shift within herself, a quiet promise rising up from the depths of her heart. She would do whatever it took to make sure Max knew he wasn't alone, not now, not ever. Just then the door opened and Marcos stepped inside, his face pale with exhaustion but his eyes softening when he saw Sophia sitting beside Max. "How's he doing?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. Sophia didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at Max, watching him breathe in slow, labored breaths. Then she turned back to her father, shaking her head. "I don't know, Dad. He's not getting any better. I'm scared." Marcos knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I know you are, Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've been through so much already. You're stronger than you think." She didn't want to be strong. She wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. Why did it always have to be her who had to face loss? First her mother, now Max? It felt like life was constantly taking things from her, leaving her with nothing but empty spaces where love once lived. "I don't know how to do this without him," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be okay if he's not okay." Marcos looked at her, his eyes sad but full of understanding. "I know, sweetheart. But you don't have to do it alone. We're in this together, remember? You and me. And Mac." Sophia nodded, but the weight of her words still felt heavy in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But the fear was suffocating, and it was hard to hold on to hope when the future felt so uncertain. She glanced down at the ornament again, its edges smooth in her hand, the inscription still clear. "Love never leaves." Max stirred again, this time more deliberately. His eyes flickered open and Sophia felt a flicker of something. Was it recognition? He shifted slightly, his tail giving the faintest of wags. "Max?" Sophia said, her voice catching. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing against his fur. For a moment there was nothing. Then, slowly, as if it took every ounce of his remaining strength, Max lifted his head and gave her a soft, almost imperceptible nudge with his nose. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "Max," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. "You're still here. You're still with me." It wasn't much. It wasn't a miraculous recovery. But in that moment, with Max's presence so strong beside her, Sophia felt a spark of hope return. Maybe, just maybe, they could do this together. Maybe Christmas wasn't about the gifts or the decorations or the perfect day. Maybe it was about this, about the people and the animals we love, and the strength we find in each other, even when everything feels broken. And in that small moment of connection, Sophia realized that despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she wasn't alone. Max wasn't alone. And somehow together they would find their way through. As night fell, the house remained cloaked in a quiet tension. Sophia sat by Max's side, her eyes never leaving him for long. The faintest signs of improvement earlier in the day had given her a thread of hope, but as the hours dragged on, her doubts began to creep back in. Max had been able to drink more water, but his energy was still low. His tail wagged weakly every now and then, but it wasn't the joyous flurry of movement she was used to. It was slow, tired, a sign that he still had a long way to go. Marcos was in the kitchen again, fiddling with a pot of soup. The kitchen light cast a soft glow into the living room, but even the warmth didn't seem to chase away the cold that had settled in Sophia's chest. Every so often she heard the clink of utensils, but otherwise the house was still. The weight of the past few days was pressing down on her, each passing second stretching her nerves thinner and thinner. She hadn't realized just how much she was holding her breath until she exhaled slowly, feeling the air leave her lungs in a quiet rush. Max shifted again, his body twitching slightly in his sleep. Sophia reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his fur, seeking reassurance. The comforting softness of him beneath her hand was enough to still her restless heart, if only for a moment. Max was here. He was still with her. But the question that haunted her was, for how long? The vet had warned her that even though Max was showing signs of improvement, it would still be a long road. Hypothermia was a dangerous thing, and the damage it did to the body could take time to heal. They were doing everything they could, but in the back of Sophia's mind, a darker thought lingered. What if it wasn't enough? The door to the kitchen opened and Marcos stepped into the living room, his eyes meeting Sophia's. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the dark circles under his eyes, but there was something else there too, something softer, almost reluctant. He sat down beside her on the floor. "Sophia," he began, his voice low and careful. "I think we need to talk about what's happening with Max." Her chest tightened. "I don't want to talk about it, Dad. Not right now. I just need him to be okay." "I know," Marcos said, his voice heavy with understanding. "I know you do. But sometimes we have to face things we don't want to, in order to do the right thing for the people, or the animals, we love." Sophia swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "What are you saying?" Marcos hesitated before continuing. "If Max doesn't improve soon, we might have to make a choice. The vet said there's a point where we'll know whether he's going to pull through, or if he's not going to make it." Sophia's hand tightened around Max's paw, as if she could will him to recover just by holding on. "No, I won't give up on him. Not now. Not ever." "I'm not saying you should give up," Marcos said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we need to be realistic. Max is hurting. And we need to think about what's best for him, too." Sophia blinked back the tears that stung her eyes. "What's best for him is for him to get better. He's not ready to go." "I know he's not." Marcos nodded slowly. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes the hardest thing to do is to know when to let go. And I don't want you to make that decision alone." Sophia sat there in silence, her heart aching with a pain so deep she wasn't sure how to bear it. She couldn't imagine a world without Max in it. The thought of losing him, of saying goodbye, was a nightmare she couldn't bring herself to face. Max shifted again, his eyes opening just enough to look at her. His gaze was weaker than it had been earlier, but there was still recognition there. Still a spark. Sophia's throat tightened as she leaned in closer to him, brushing her lips against his ear. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't leave me. I need you." Max's tail gave the faintest of wags, a small but significant movement that made Sophia's heart leap. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment she felt as though he was telling her he wasn't ready to go. He wasn't giving up. But despite the small signs of hope, a knot of fear still twisted in her stomach. What if she was just fooling herself? What if the inevitable was coming and no matter how much she willed it, it wouldn't change the outcome? The hours stretched on, each minute dragging as they waited for some sign that Max's condition was improving. Sophia couldn't sit still. She paced back and forth, checking on him every few minutes, as if her constant presence could somehow help him heal faster. But with each passing second, the reality of the situation pressed down harder. Max's breathing remained shallow, his eyes fluttering open and closed, but he was still so weak. It was then that the phone rang. Marcos answered it in the kitchen, his voice low and steady as he spoke with the vet. Sophia stayed by Max's side, her hand resting on his side, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his chest beneath her palm. She didn't want to know what the vet had to say. She didn't want to hear that they had reached a point where they would have to make a decision. The phone call lasted longer than she expected, and when Marcos finally returned, his face was pale, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sophia, and for a moment, it was as if he didn't know how to speak the words. "The vet says we have a window," he said quietly. "A chance to get him to the hospital. But it has to be now before it's too late." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The hospital. Max wasn't well enough to travel. It felt impossible. But if this was their last chance. "I'll do whatever it takes," Sophia said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "Get him to the hospital. We're not giving up on him." With a soft sigh, Marcos nodded. He gathered Max up gently, and together they headed out into the night, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of what the morning might bring. But Sophia had one thing in her heart that she wasn't willing to let go of: the belief that love, no matter how much it was tested, could bring them through. The cold night air hit Sophia like a wall as she stepped out into the driveway. The world outside was dark, the only light coming from the headlights of the car and the faint glow from their porch. Marcos was already in the driver's seat, Max lying on the back seat, carefully propped up with blankets. Sophia climbed in beside him, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. She could feel Max's shallow breathing beside her, the faint rise and fall of his chest almost imperceptible in the stillness. "He's going to be okay, right, Dad?" Sophia asked, her voice a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would make the fragile hope she clung to disappear. Marcos didn't respond right away, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a tense, almost frantic energy. He had never been one to show weakness, but Sophia could feel his fear in the way he drove, the way his gaze kept darting between the road and the rearview mirror, checking on Max as if by doing so he could somehow will him to get better. "I hope so," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "But the vet said we have to get him there fast. This is our best shot, Sophia. We just have to trust that we're doing the right thing." Sophia nodded but didn't speak. Her thoughts were swirling, fighting to stay grounded in the moment, but it was difficult. Every thought seemed to spiral back to the same question: would they get there in time? Would they make it to the hospital before it was too late? Max had been her constant companion for so long. When things got tough, he was always there, a steady presence who never wavered. He had kept her company through sleepless nights and the most difficult days of her life, and now he needed her. She couldn't fail him now. She reached over and gently placed her hand on Max's fur, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her fingers, reassuring herself that he was still there, still fighting. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every turn, every bump in the road seemed to stretch out into infinity, the miles disappearing under the tires but somehow never bringing them any closer to their destination. Sophia's mind kept replaying the images of Max in her arms, the way he had looked earlier, so fragile, so vulnerable. Sophia had always known that life was unpredictable, but she had never imagined it would take her down a road like this, where the very thing she loved most was slipping away. Her mother's passing had been hard enough to bear, but at least with her mother, there was a sense of closure. There was an ending. With Max, she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to let go. Marcos's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just a few more minutes?" Sophia nodded, but the knot in her stomach only tightened. She could barely see through the tears that had gathered in her eyes. Every part of her was focused on the idea that once they got to the hospital, once Max was under the care of the doctors, he would be okay. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they had waited too long? The hospital loomed in the distance, its bright lights like a beacon in the dark. When they finally pulled into the parking lot, Sophia could barely get out of the car fast enough. Marcos hurried to open the door, and together they carefully lifted Max, trying to be as gentle as possible. Sophia could feel his weight, his body growing heavier with each passing moment, but she refused to let herself think about what that might mean. Inside, the sterile scent of the hospital hit her like a physical blow. The hustle and bustle of nurses and doctors in the emergency room felt distant, as if everything was happening in slow motion. A nurse came over immediately, her expression sympathetic but efficient. "We'll take him from here," the nurse said, motioning for them to follow. "I'll get him to the treatment area." Sophia and Marcos followed the nurse down the long, brightly lit hallway. Sophia's heart beat in her throat, each step feeling heavier than the last. They arrived at the treatment room, and the nurse gently placed Max onto the examination table. "Wait here," she said softly. "We'll get started right away." Sophia nodded, her throat tight, but she couldn't stop herself from following Max with her eyes, watching as the nurse and a few other staff members began hooking him up to machines and monitoring his vitals. "We're doing everything we can," the nurse reassured them before stepping back out of the room, leaving them alone with their thoughts. Sophia sank into a nearby chair, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was hard. It was hard to be patient when every part of her wanted to rush to fix things to make them better. She had always been the one who stayed calm in the storm, but now it felt like she was drowning. Her entire life had been turned upside down in the span of a few days, and the uncertainty of it all was unbearable. Beside her, Marcos sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the door where the doctors had gone. He hadn't said much since they arrived, his face lined with the same exhaustion that had marked the past few days. His hand was tightly wrapped around his phone, as if he were waiting for a call that would bring some kind of answer. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every tick of the clock on the wall was a reminder that they were waiting for something, anything, that would tell them how long they would have with Max. Sophia glanced at her father, seeing the same fear reflected in his eyes that she felt in her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew there were no easy ones. No guarantees. No magic fixes. Max was strong. He had always been strong. But was it enough? Was love enough to pull him through? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the room opened. The nurse stepped in, her face unreadable. Sophia and Marcos both jumped to their feet. "We've stabilized him," she said quietly. "But it's going to take time. He's not out of the woods yet, but the worst seems to be over. For now." Sophia exhaled sharply, the relief washing over her like a wave. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't the end of their fight. But for the first time in days, Sophia allowed herself to hope. "Thank you," Marcos said, his voice rough with emotion. Sophia said nothing, her eyes fixed on the nurse as she continued to give them the details of Max's care. But inside, Sophia knew one thing. Whatever happened, she wasn't giving up on him. Not now. Not ever. And as she sat there beside Max, her hand gently resting on his, she promised herself that she would fight for him with everything she had. No matter what the future held, she wouldn't let go. Not yet. The night stretched on in a haze of sterile lights and distant voices. Sophia couldn't keep still, her legs bouncing nervously under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room. Her eyes darted to the clock, counting the minutes, but the minutes seemed to stretch into hours, mocking her anxiety. Max was still in the back, and although the nurse had said they had stabilized him, Sophia couldn't shake the nagging fear that things were still too uncertain. She wanted to be there with him, to see him, to touch him and let him know that she was still there. But the doctors had insisted she wait. There was nothing she could do now except sit in the quiet, waiting for an update. Beside her, Marcos sat with his phone in hand, tapping it absent-mindedly but not truly looking at the screen. His face was drawn, as if the weight of the world was sitting on his shoulders. The exhaustion was clear in his features, but there was also a glimmer of something else, hope, however fragile. Sophia kept glancing at the door, praying for someone to come through, to tell her that Max was okay, that he was going to make it. But every second that passed only deepened the silence between them. There were no words left to say, no reassurances to give. The weight of the past days was pressing down on her chest. The shock of finding Max outside, cold and unresponsive, still felt fresh, like a wound that hadn't healed. It had all happened so quickly. One minute they were going about their daily lives, and the next, everything had been turned upside down. Her world had shifted on its axis, and she wasn't sure how to find her balance again. "Do you think he's going to be okay, Dad?" Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Marcos looked over at her, his eyes tired but kind. He didn't give a direct answer though. Instead, he gave her a small, knowing smile. "I think Max is stronger than we give him credit for. You know how stubborn he is. He'll fight." Sophia tried to smile back, but the truth was she wasn't sure if her heart could take another night of waiting, of praying for a miracle that might never come. Her mind kept flashing to the image of Max curled up on the couch, his eyes looking up at her with trust, with love. That was the thing with animals, they never gave up on you no matter how bad things got. They just loved you, no questions asked. She looked down at her hands, the tightness in her chest making it hard to breathe. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Another hour passed before a doctor finally walked into the waiting room. He was tall, with a calm, measured look in his eyes. He seemed like someone who had delivered difficult news before. His expression was serious but not without compassion. Sophia's heart lurched in her chest. She stood quickly, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "How's he doing?" she asked, her hands trembling. The doctor nodded, pausing for a moment before speaking. "Max is stable for now," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "He's not out of danger, but he's responding to the treatment. His vitals are steady and we've started warming him up slowly. It's going to take time though." We have to monitor him closely, but I believe there's a good chance he'll pull through." Sophia felt the air rush from her lungs, but it wasn't quite the relief she had hoped for. "But he's not okay yet," she said, her voice cracking. "No," the doctor agreed. "He's not out of the woods. But he's a fighter and we'll continue to do everything we can." Sophia nodded, her throat tight, her heart a twisted mix of hope and fear. She wanted to thank him, to show him how much she appreciated the news, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was nod, barely holding it together. The doctor gave them one last reassuring look before leaving, and Sophia sank back into her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She glanced at her father, who was looking at her with the same quiet hope that had been in his voice when he spoke earlier. She could see it in his eyes, that same wish that everything would somehow be okay. But Sophia couldn't let herself hope just yet. Not fully. They had been through so much. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Max after all they had been through together. She couldn't lose him like this. She sat there in silence, trying to find a way to quiet the storm of fear that was raging inside her. She wanted to be strong, to believe that Max would make it through, but the fear was like a heavy weight pulling her under. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath, trying to calm herself. Max was a fighter. He had been there for her in so many ways over the years. Now she had to be there for him. Time moved in strange, slow waves after that. Every sound, every movement felt exaggerated. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the footsteps in the hallway, it was as if the world had shrunk down to the small, enclosed space of the waiting room. Marcos finally broke the silence. "Sophia," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Whatever happens, I want you to know I'm proud of you. For everything you've done, for the way you've cared for Max. I know it's hard, but you've been strong, sweetheart. More than I ever expected." Sophia didn't know what to say to that. Her heart felt heavy, the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't imagine a life without Max. She wasn't ready for that yet. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Your dog is asking for you," she said simply. "You can come in now." Sophia's heart skipped. She leaped to her feet, her breath catching in her throat. "He's awake?" she asked, hope flaring up despite herself. The nurse nodded. "He's alert. You can see him now." Sophia's legs felt weak as she followed the nurse down the hallway, her pulse quickening with every step. She reached the door of Max's room, pausing for just a second before she entered. She didn't know what to expect, but when she stepped inside and saw Max lying there on the bed, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition, her heart nearly stopped. He was still weak, still fragile, but he was here. He was alive. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Sophia stepped forward, her voice a whisper. "Max," she gently ran her hand over his fur, relief flooding her chest. "You made it. You're going to be okay." Max looked up at her, his tail giving a weak wag, and in that small movement, Sophia knew that despite everything, they had made it through. Together. For the first time in what felt like days, Sophia allowed herself to hope again. She wasn't ready to say everything would be fine, but in this moment she had her Max back. And for now that was enough. Sophia sat by Max's side, her fingers gently brushing through his fur as she watched him sleep. The beeping of the heart monitor was a steady, rhythmic sound, the only noise in the otherwise silent room. The nurses had come in a few times to check on him, adjusting the four-drip and monitoring his progress. But for now it was just her and Max. And in that quiet, there was a peace she hadn't felt in days. Max was still weak, his body not fully recovered from the shock of what had happened. His eyes would flutter open every now and then, looking at her with a quiet recognition before drifting back to sleep. But despite the exhaustion that still clung to him, Sophia could see it, the familiar spark of life in his gaze. It wasn't the same as before, but it was enough. Enough to hold on to. Enough to believe that he could get better. She reached for his paw, holding it between her hands, feeling the warmth of him under her touch. The warmth was reassuring, grounding her in the moment. She couldn't think too far ahead. She couldn't imagine what life would be like if he didn't make it. Right now, she had to focus on the present, on the fact that Max was still with her, still fighting. "Hey Max," she whispered, her voice soft, "you're going to make it through this. I know you are. I'm not giving up on you." Max's tail gave a weak twitch, almost like a silent agreement, and Sophia smiled through the tears that were once again welling in her eyes. She didn't want to let herself cry again. She couldn't. But it was hard not to, with all the emotions swirling inside her. Relief, fear, hope, and gratitude. Max was her best friend, her constant companion, and she couldn't lose him. Not after everything they had been through together. Her thoughts wandered back to the moment she had found him in the cold, limp and lifeless in the snow. The fear she had felt in that instant still gripped her heart, the memory of rushing to him, desperate, hoping it wasn't too late. It felt like a dream now, an awful nightmare-like dream. But Max had pulled through. He wasn't gone. He was still here. And for that she was grateful beyond words. Marcos had stayed with her as long as he could, but someone needed to look after the house, to make sure everything was taken care of. He had promised to be back as soon as he could, but in the meantime, it was just Sophia and Max. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the machines and the distant sound of voices in the hallway. Time seemed to stretch on in an endless loop, each minute dragging its feet like an eternity. Sophia tried to stay busy, checking on Max, talking to him, holding his paw. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a fragile moment, a delicate one, and she couldn't afford to waste it. The door to the room opened and Sophia's head snapped up, her heart racing. A doctor stepped inside, a kind-looking woman with short, dark hair and a warm smile. "How is he?" Sophia asked, her voice anxious. The doctor glanced at Max, her expression calm but professional. "He's still stable," she said. "He's responding well to the treatment, and his vitals are holding steady. But it's still too early to say what his full recovery will look like. We'll need to keep monitoring him, but we're cautiously optimistic." Sophia felt a wave of relief wash over her. Cautiously optimistic was the best news she had heard in days. But she knew better than to get too hopeful just yet. There was still a long road ahead. Max had been through so much, and the trauma his body had endured wasn't something that could be healed in a matter of hours. "Can I stay with him?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to leave his side, not even for a second. The doctor nodded. "Of course. He'll need your presence and support as much as anything else. I'll let the nurses know that you're here." Sophia smiled gratefully, not trusting herself to speak. She couldn't put into words how much this meant to her, being able to stay with Max, to be there when he needed her most. In a world full of uncertainty, this was the one thing she could control. The doctor left and Sophia settled back into her chair, her eyes not leaving Max for a second. He was still asleep, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He looked peaceful now, but Sophia knew better than to let herself relax completely. She had seen too much in the past few days, too much uncertainty, too much pain. Max's recovery wasn't guaranteed. Not yet. As the hours ticked by, Sophia tried to stay busy, reading a book, checking her phone, even talking to Max like he could hear her. But mostly, she just sat with him, her hand resting on his side, offering him the comfort of her presence. It was all she could do. In the quiet, her thoughts began to wander again. The past few days had been a blur of fear and desperation, but now that she had a moment to breathe, the reality of the situation started to hit her again. She had come so close to losing him. So close to being without him forever. It wasn't just the thought of losing Max that hurt, it was the thought of not being able to say goodbye. The fear that she wouldn't be there when he needed her most. But she had been there. She had fought for him just like he had always fought for her. And that meant everything. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, breaking the stillness. She glanced at the screen, seeing a message from Marcos. "I'm on my way back. How's he doing?" Sophia quickly typed back. "He's stable. Still a long way to go, but he's fighting. I'm not leaving him." She set her phone down and turned her attention back to Max. In that moment, she knew that she wasn't just waiting for him to recover. She was waiting for herself to believe that everything would be okay again, that this pain, this uncertainty would eventually fade. Max had been her rock, her constant in a world that often felt uncertain. Now she was the one holding him up. And that gave her strength. The door opened again and Marco stepped in, his tired face lighting up when he saw Max's steady breathing. He didn't say anything at first, just walked over and put a hand on Sophia's shoulder, squeezing it gently. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with a quiet resolve. "He's going to be okay, right, Dad?" she asked again, the words sounding different this time, not as desperate as before. Marcos didn't respond right away. Instead, he just nodded, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "I think so, sweetheart. I really think so." Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving Max. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the quiet hope that had settled in her chest. But for the first time in days, she let herself believe it too. Maybe, just maybe, they had made it through. Together. It was early morning when Sophia finally saw Max stir. The faint light of dawn filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. She had barely slept the night before, her body stiff from hours of sitting by his side, but her heart was full of a quiet, unspoken hope. Max had made it through the night, and that alone was something to hold on to. She hadn't been able to fully allow herself to believe it, until now. But as she watched him shift his position, his eyes slowly opening to meet hers, the truth became undeniable. He was still here. He was still fighting. "Max," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with emotion. She leaned forward, her hands trembling as they reached out to him. "You're awake." Max blinked a few times, his eyes flickering in the dim light. His body was still frail and he was clearly exhausted, but there was a spark in his gaze that wasn't there before. Slowly, his tail gave a tiny, tentative wag, just enough to make Sophia's heart leap in her chest. "I knew you'd make it," she murmured, tears welling up in her eyes as she gently ran her fingers through his fur. "I never gave up on you, Mac." Max didn't respond with words, but his quiet presence spoke volumes. He was alive. And he was still her Max, the dog who had saved her time and time again. The dog who had never left her side no matter what. Sophia let herself breathe, truly breathe for the first time in days. The tight knot in her chest that had been there since the accident began to loosen. She knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Recovery was a long and uncertain road, and Max still had a long way to go. But for now, for this moment, he was here. And that was enough. Marcos had been in and out, staying just long enough to check in on Max, offering comfort to Sophia, and ensuring the house was taken care of. But now it was just the two of them, Max and Sophia. She wouldn't leave him now. She couldn't. Hours passed, and Sophia stayed with Max, talking to him softly, reminding him of the good days they had shared. The walks in the park, the lazy afternoons on the couch, the way Max would always nudge her hand for a pet when she was reading. Those little things that made her life with him feel complete. But even as she spoke, she knew Max wasn't fully back yet. His breathing was still shallow at times, and he had difficulty lifting his head without assistance. But every time he shifted or nuzzled into her touch, Sophia felt a little more of the weight lift from her chest. There was a chance, there was still hope. By the afternoon, the doctor came in again. Dr. Jensen had been the one to give them the good news the night before, and though her expression was calm, Sophia could see the concern in her eyes as she took a seat by Max's bed. "He's still responding well," Dr. Jensen reported, her voice steady. "But we need to keep him under close observation. The trauma he sustained isn't something that heals overnight. His body needs time. We'll continue to monitor his condition and adjust his treatment as necessary." Sophia nodded, trying to push down the unease that still lingered in her stomach. The doctor's words were careful, measured. It was clear that they weren't out of danger yet. But there was something else in Dr. Jensen's tone, something softer, a hint of encouragement. "He's a resilient dog," she added, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's going to take time, but I have no doubt he's a fighter." Sophia's heart swelled at the words. Maybe this was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment where she could finally let go of the fear that had consumed her for so long. Maybe, just maybe, Max would pull through. "I'll stay with him," Sophia said, her voice firm but gentle. Dr. Jensen gave her a nod and stood to leave, pausing at the door. "We'll check in again later, but don't hesitate to call if you need anything." As the door clicked shut behind the doctor, Sophia looked down at Max, still lying there, his breathing steady but slow. She couldn't imagine her life without him. He had been with her through every major moment, through the highs and the lows, the laughter and the tears. Max had been her companion, her protector, her friend. And now it was her turn to be there for him. Marcos had promised to bring over some things from home, Max's favorite blanket, a few toys and some of his food, but for now it was just the two of them. And that was all that mattered. Sophia sat back down beside the bed, her hand gently resting on Max's, and let the quiet wash over her. There was something so soothing in the silence, something comforting in just being present with him. Max stirred a little, his body shifting, and Sophia leaned closer, her voice soft. "I know you're tired, buddy, but we're in this together, okay? I'm not leaving you. I promise." Max's eyes opened just slightly, and Sophia swore she saw a glimmer of understanding in them. His tail twitched again, a small sign of recognition of life. For a moment, Sophia allowed herself to believe, to truly believe, that Max would make it through this. He would fight his way back to her just like he always had. And this time he wouldn't have to do it alone. She leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his head, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've got this, Max, together." And with that, she settled back into her chair, her heart full of the quiet certainty that, no matter how long it took, they would find their way back to each other. It was a long road ahead, but they would walk it side by side. Max was her family. And that meant everything. As Max's steady breathing filled the room, Sophia couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. It was a journey marked by fear, by the overwhelming uncertainty of almost losing the one being she loved most in this world. But it was also a journey of unwavering hope, of belief in a bond that couldn't be broken. Through every moment of pain, every tear, Sophia never gave up on Max, and he never gave up on her. This story isn't just about the survival of a dog. It's about the power of loyalty, of resilience, and the deep, unspoken connection between two souls who will always fight for each other. It's a reminder that no matter how dark the path may seem, there is always a flicker of hope to hold on to. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on the love and loyalty we share with the ones we hold dear, then take a moment to show your support. Like, share, and comment below. Let us know how this story resonated with you. And if you want more heartwarming tales of courage, love, and triumph, don't forget to subscribe. Join us on this emotional journey, where every story is more than just a story. It's a reminder that hope, no matter how fragile, is always worth fighting for. Share the love. Share the story. Because sometimes all we need is a little faith to make it through.